Strong chess players realize patterns and can immediately see opportunities, said Garry Kasparov. And indeed, largely chess game comes down to pattern recognition, as no one can memorize virtually unlimited quantity of chess variations. So today we're going to talk about the top 3 most important tactical patterns that every chess player needs to know. After that, we'll put it to test. I'll do a puzzle rush for a minute, seeing how many puzzles I can get within 1 minute. And then we'll move on to the most intriguing part. Magic tricks revealed. How do grandmasters find tactics quickly and easily? The first, most important tactical pattern is called a double attack. It's when a single piece of yours attacks multiple pieces of your opponent, and therefore he's unable to defend both of them at the same time. Although any chess piece can deliver a double attack, it happens most often with your knight, the trickiest chess piece. Such as in similar positions to this, you can jump with your knight to c7, delivering this double attack, also known as a fork, winning the rook on the next move. In an opening phase, there are some really common ways for your opponent to fall into a double attack. One of them occurs from the Jabava-London system, and here knight to c6 is very popular, occurred in millions of games, and white can jump with their knight to b5, creating this threat of knight takes c7. For example, if black plays some move, knight takes c7 is double attack of the rook and king. Notice that the knight is guarded, therefore black can't save it, and therefore on the next move they're going to be losing material. Funnily enough, in this position, a lot of chess players decided to save their rook from the knight fork by moving the rook to b8, but fell into the bishop fork after bishop takes c7 with another double attack. Another extremely common way for you to win a game occurs in the King's Gambit, when you counter with the Folk-Beer counter gambit, and at this point or during one of the following moves, your opponents might be tempted to capture this pawn on e5, which in fact is a major blunder. Now you play not queen g5, queen to h4 check, white needs to cover, and then queen take e4 delivers this double attack, winning the rook on the next move. How would you play here if you were playing black? It's black to play. White has just played pawn to a3, attacking this knight on b4, trying to push it away. So what would you do here? I'm pretty sure that most players would just retreat their knight to c6. And that brings us to the next idea, the next pattern, which is called simply a check. Now, it's strictly speaking not a tactical motif, it is just a move. However, think about this. If you just create an obvious threat, unless your opponent is a total beginner, he or she will counteract it somehow. Right? So how do you force your opponent into a disadvantageous situation? You need to use forcing moves, the moves that force a particular response of your opponent. And the most forcing move in chess is a check. That is why you need to be on the lookout for checks. Very often, a double attack or any other tactical motif also involves a check somewhere along the way. Because again, that's how you force your opponent into the position you want to get. For example, here, instead of just retreating the knight, you can go knight a2 check, forcing the king to move. The only legal square is b1, and now you've got one more check, which also happens to be a double attack. And by using the check, we actually forced our opponent into the position we aim to get. That is how combining checks with all other tactical motifs can bring you those great results. Besides that, there is the second really useful idea that you can take away from this example. I call it backward is awkward, or principle of maximum activity. In other words, you should aim to move your pieces forward in chess, whenever possible, okay? So although again, most players would just retreat their knight to c6 unthinkingly, you should always know that backward is awkward, and that is the last thing that you do unless you have nothing better. But your first impulse should be looking in the forward direction. That's how you find stronger moves and attacking moves. Now, that's not a subject of this video, but if you want to dive deeper into these useful rules of thinking, I've got a dedicated free masterclass about that. You can click the link below the video and check it out later. The next extremely common tactical motif is called a pin. Is when you restrict your opponent's piece and he can't move out of your way of attack without exposing a more valuable piece standing behind. In this case, a knight is actually pinned in every possible direction. Vertically, then also diagonally to the king and diagonally to the rook. And here is a more realistic situation when you can make use of a pin. In this case, both black's knights are pinned. This knight is pinned down to the king, and that is called an absolute pin. This is the strongest pin possible because the knight cannot move at all, it is just illegal. The other knight is pinned down to the queen, and that is a relative pin, meaning the knight can theoretically move, although it's highly unlikely to happen because then they would drop the queen. Now, how do you make use of a pin? Well, you need to increase the pressure. So how do you do that? Well, there are a number of ways. If you want to attack this knight, for example, you may jump with this knight forward, put more pressure, and possibly expose their king, especially if, let's say, the king is standing there. You can then trade off, forcing them to expose their king. They can't capture with the queen because of your knight, but if they capture with a pawn, that opens up the king, and we can do something like queen d2, queen h6, knight takes f6, and hopefully checkmate black pretty soon. So that's one way to go about this. The other way to go about this is to use this pin. In this case, we can just go forward with d5 and win the knight right on the next move. That's probably the easiest way for white right here to win the game. Or alternatively, you can take on e5, taking advantage of the fact that the knight looks like it defends the pawn, but in reality can't move. Again, it's pinned. And therefore, after the trade, you can just go ahead and take this pawn. You win the pawn, plus you add one more attack to this knight on c6. How do you use a pin in a real game? Well, here's probably the most common example of all, the fried liver attack. Right here, white threatens a fork after knight takes f7, forking the queen and rook, and if black tries to block the diagonal for the bishop after the exchange, natural move knight takes d5 happens to be a big blunder, because it allows white this knight takes f7 anyways, and then queen to f3, and we're using a double attack, once again, the motif we talked about before, plus a pin. The knight is pinned down to the king. Therefore, even if black guards the knight right now, since the knight is pinned, we can actually add more and more pressure against it, and black can possibly be in big trouble right here. For example, sometimes they try to counterattack with knight to d4, but that fails because bishop to d5 is a check. Another thing we talked about before. Notice that all these ideas, a fork, a pin, and a check, occurs across various different variations, and that is why I say that they're most common. They're something that is actually happening in real chess, unlike some, discovered checks and stuff like that, which actually occurs mostly in chess puzzles, and although sometimes in real games, but not that often. Now here, after the king moves somewhere, you can just keep attacking it and maybe even checkmate it. And here's another funny example of a pin. In this position, which arose from the Ruy Lopez opening, white may play knight d4, putting pressure here, and if black tries to guard it, this move turns out to be a losing blunder. It's funny that this position first occurred over 100 years ago in the game between Tarrasch against Zukertort, but people keep falling for this trap up to this day. Here white wins by knight takes e6, and whether black has a choice of how to capture the knight, it turns out that in both cases they lose. If they capture with the queen, now the queen, this pawn is getting pinned to the queen, and white can just go ahead and capture the knight. Quite funny. Now, if instead black decided to capture it by this pawn, white still captures the knight on e4, but this time the pawn is pinned still to the queen, but in a different way. Here's another funny line, and I actually won a number of games myself using this exact opening trap. It occurs in the Sicilian defense, in the Sveshnikov variation. You go knight d5, threatening knight to c7, forking the king and rook. After black trades, they need to move the knight away, and after the knight moves, you play c4, which looks like just a normal move, solidifying your center. After they try to get rid of this knight from b5 by going a6, there is an interesting pin and counter pin follow-up. You play queen a4. All of a sudden, you keep your knight right here, and you pin their pawn down to the rook. Therefore, if they capture your knight, you're going to grab their rook. To this, in most cases, it's the most played move by black, they play bishop d7. They're trying to counter your pin by their counter pin. They say, hey, we're going to pin your knight and then win it on the next move. But it turns out that they blundered this knight takes d6 smothered checkmate, which is another tactical motif when black's own pieces smother their own king because, frankly, they always wanted to rule themselves. Now let's put it to a test. I'll be doing a puzzle rush for 1 minute, solving different tactical puzzles. If you wish to do it with me, you're welcome to do so, or you may decrease the video speed to 0.5 so that you have a little more time to think. If you don't want to see it for a minute, just skip to the next part 1 minute later, where we'll be going to the Magic Tricks Revealed section, where I'll be explaining how do title players solve tactical puzzles easily most of the time. Alright, so how do title players solve puzzles that quickly? And to be frank, what I'm doing here is nothing unique. Those who practice puzzles and blitz frequently can do it even faster. So how do you do that? Now, here's the key. It's not really as much about knowing the great variety of tactical patterns, but much more about the right way of thinking. And the right way of thinking is focusing your attention on your opponent's side of the board, on that other half of the board, and asking yourself how can you play a forcing move there, which is a check, a capture, and an attacking move, right? So you focus on that. Now, in this particular position, I would also say that it's pretty clear that we're trying to attack the king, that all the tension is somewhere there, and generally you win a chess game by attacking the king. Therefore, in reality, the focus is even more narrow, like it's this quarter of the board, I would say. So all the focus is on this fragment of the board and how do you play forcing moves there, checks, captures, attacking moves, and fundamentally checks, because checks are the most forcing move. Your opponent has to guard the king, there's nothing else that he can possibly do. Therefore, keeping this in mind, if I'm looking at, okay, queen takes g6, that's just a trade. We're gonna trade everything on g6, nothing special. Rook h8, well, he just grabs the rook, nothing happens. So h takes g6, the only move that's worth considering. And after we capture here, and it's kind of the same question. You focus your attention on this quarter of the board, asking yourself what are the checks, captures you've got there, and you see that queen takes g6 is just a trade, nothing special, rook to h8, and then you notice, oh, if I go there and he captures, I can actually grab the queen. So that's how you do this calculation pretty quickly. Now the question for you, what if black goes king to g zone? How do you play here as white? I mean, think about this for a second. And again, I want to highlight that it's not as much about knowing all these tactical patterns, much more about the right way of thinking. Because I'm a grandmaster, but if you ask me to even name all tactical motifs in chess, I'd probably have a hard time naming even half of them, because there are so many, and common checkmating patterns and tactical motifs and whatnot. What I'm actually doing is I'm following this way of thinking, because that's the check that I can see, or queen takes g6, so I'll be choosing between these two moves fundamentally. Now it's your turn. It is white to play and win here. Please try to find the right solution, and if you can, write it down in comments below. And if you want to know how I went from 1600 to 2260 rating in 1 year, check out my video right there.